Okay, everyone, it's 2:15, which means it is time to hear from Catherine, whose mentor is Mitty Murr, and the presentation today is titled Witches, Demons, and Drums, Exploring Gender and Witch Trials in Early Modern Scandinavia. So I'm going to turn it over to Catherine and let her share her screen, and we will be underway shortly.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Sorry, let me figure out how to share this really quickly. Okay, so
Perfect.
Can y'all see that all right?
Looks great, Catherine.
Okay, so I'll just start. So during my time at St. Edward's and through classes I've taken both in Austin and abroad, I have developed an interest in European history and women and gender studies. For my thesis, I wanted to choose a project that looks at both of those topics, which is essentially what led me to explore the phenomenon of witch trials. Witch trials occurred in early modern Europe, and witchcraft was used as an explanation for all sorts of misfortunes that occurred at the time, from interpersonal conflicts like disputes between neighbors to more widespread problems such as weather patterns or economic instability. If we were in the 17th century now, it's likely that witchcraft would be the explanation for the coronavirus. This is a time for major political and religious reform, which was a very messy process. States were trying to consolidate the religious community and bring people together under one national identity. It is important to consider all of the changes that were taking place at the time because it had a huge effect on the mindset of the population. And because these changes didn't occur uniformly across Europe, how they took place and when they took place affected the witch trials that happened as well. The excitement that fueled the Reformation also created fears about evil within Christian societies. And as a result, non-Christians and anyone that seemed to threaten the society was persecuted. Establishing religious homogeneity in the region was a political motive as well as a way of controlling the behavior within a certain society, enforcing power, and ridding the community of anything that was perceived as evil. So the extent of the witch hunts and number of victims, oh gosh, how do I change the slide? Technical difficulty. There we go. So the extent of the witch hunts and number of victims vary tremendously by region, as well as other details about the victims, such as their gender, ethnicity, and religion. When I began to look into this, I noticed that most of the material on witch trials, they only covered renowned incidents that happened in Northwestern Europe, in countries like Germany, France, Scotland, and England. So because of this, scholars have drawn conclusions mainly based off of those countries. And when we hear the word witch, we tend to think of women. So while the majority of people accused of and executed for witchcraft were female, a significant portion of the alleged witches were male. What I find particularly interesting is that male victims were most commonly found in Scandinavia. Male witches in total account for around a fifth to a quarter of all of accused witches. However, there's very little information about witch trials in Scandinavia, and even less of that information is in English. So my overall research aims to examine these regional differences using the lens of gender analysis to understand why Scandinavia might be so different and why gender seems to operate differently in this region, as you can see in the more equal gender balance in witchcraft prosecutions. So let's take a look at gender. It's clear that gender is operating differently in this region since women have primarily been the focus of witch trials in Europe. From the witch trials that happened in Northwestern Europe, early scholars have drawn the conclusion that consisted of women and witches on one side and men and non-witches on the other. However, the concept of the male witch is not a new concept. Scholars Laura Apps and Andrew Gow have proposed that gender and sex be separated in order to conceptualize male witches. The Hammer of Witches is an example of the emergence of what is known as a new theory of witchcraft, which is also referred to as demonology or diabolism. They point out that the primary component for being a witch is weak-mindedness, which is not necessarily bound to gender. Basically, people start to think that some people would make direct pacts with the devil and form unions of witches. These witches would fly in the middle of the night to witches' sabbaths, where they would make homage to the devil and take part in collective evil deeds, usually against merchants, government officials, or anyone in a position of power. The belief in the imminent presence of the devil and secretive nature of these supposed unions led to a feeling of anxiety wherever this theory took hold, as it broadened the idea of who a witch could be. However, in Scandinavia, they would tailor folkloric magic to fit into this frame of thinking. Although in my research, I have chosen to cover various parts of Scandinavia, for the purpose of this presentation, I will only be focusing on the trials that occurred in the northernmost part of Europe in the county of Finnmark of northern Norway. This case doesn't quite fit into the same patterns that we see in northwestern Europe. Witch trials in this region were notably severe and among the worst of the century, relative to its population. This may be due to factors such as geographical distance from higher administrative courts, the influence of traditional folkloric belief, and presence of indigenous populations, as well as the outside influence of individuals that came from northwestern Europe. First, let's take a look at the geographic layout of the time. So in the early modern period, Scandinavia was dominated by the presence of two kingdoms, the Kingdom of Sweden, Finland, and the Kingdom of Norway, Denmark. The distance of Finnmark from the capital of the kingdom in Copenhagen is extremely important in how the events played out, as this is a highly disputed territory. Since it was so far from the capital, courts were under local jurisdiction and operated almost independently, which became very problematic over the time as it gave certain individuals a huge amount of jurisdiction. Borders in Lapland were not clear, and there was a lot of disputed territory between the kingdoms. Populations were pretty sparse and scattered about throughout the region. Most of the trials took place in small fishing villages along the coast in the towns of Vardo and Vadsø. So those are seen here. People who lived in this region had to be tough, and women as a minority in these smaller populations, since fishing was a male-dominated job, had a considerable amount of independence compared to what was seen further south in the kingdom. The county of Finnmark accounted for less than 1% of Norway's total population at the time. In the tiny fishing villages along the coast where witch trials took place, most of the towns only had a few hundred people, and for this reason, the trials were particularly devastating. However, what sets this region apart from other areas of Europe is that Sami and Norwegians lived side by side. The Sami, the indigenous group of the Arctic, were mainly a nomadic people, and they moved across borders following reindeer migration patterns. At a time of state formation, the Sami posed a unique problem for authorities, and their presence intensified border disputes during this period. The Sami were also known for their shamanistic beliefs, and their culture contained ritualistic drumming and chanting. Traditional folk belief, as well as the ethnic makeup of the population in this region, gave them a reputation for evil and magic that spread across Europe. Shamanism is a type of magic that is unique to Lapland, and it was a male tradition. They were known for harnessing supernatural forces, selling favorable winds, and traveling to other worlds. In general, in most parts of Scandinavia, before the theory of diabolism emerged, most trials were small and mainly dealt with individual issues that arose between neighbors. Health and livestock were common subjects of this magic, and white magic was not usually punished until much later. But in general, at the time, people seemed to believe that the more removed from a society a person was, the more evil a sorcerer they were believed to be. And as the new theory of witchcraft came about, people started to say that the entrance to hell was in Tedmon Mountain, which is in, oh gosh, I don't know why these slides don't like to change. Well, I have a picture of Tedmon Mountain, usually. Oh, all right. Oh goodness. So here is Tedmon Mountain. So this is where the entrance to hell was supposedly. People would write about witches flying to Sabbats in the far north to this mountain. In the Arctic, there was already a strong presence of pre-Christian religion due to the Sami culture, and it was pantheistic and very different from the Lutheran orthodoxy that was being pushed by the church at this time. This may account for one reason as to why it was seen as a hotbed for supernatural activity. Oh, thank you. So, as the new theory of witchcraft came about, that was why it was such a big problem in the region. Also, the environment had to do with this reputation for evil, because they would see periods of extended darkness in the wintertime and the infamous midnight sun in the summertime. Coincidentally, most of the trials occurred here in the wintertime. You can imagine how strange the fires must have appeared in contrast to the snow-covered and treeless landscape. Relative to the population, the trials that took place here were some of the worst in the 17th century. The worst trials were seen in spikes in the 1620s, 1650s, and 1660s. These specific panics dealt mainly with diabolism, which was a new phenomenon in this region, which is very contrary to earlier scholarship, which stated that this theory was not present in the peripheries of Europe. The spread of ideas about this new theory can be traced to the influence of certain individuals who traveled to the region. Before 1620, the majority of trials that took place were singular trials that dealt with cases dealing with black magic or shamanism, and those were mostly men. However, from 1620 to 1670, most of the accused were Norwegian women. Gosh, I cannot get these slides to work, but that's okay. We're going to continue. There we go. So in 1617, Christian the third of Denmark issued a decree against witches and their accomplices, defining real witches as those who attach themselves to the devil. In 1619, a Scotsman named John Cunningham was appointed as district governor in Finnmark. Cunningham was an interesting man and was well acquainted with James VI of Scotland and had a successful naval career under Christian IV. James VI was a learned demonologist, and Cunningham shared a lot of his beliefs about witchcraft. So he was appointed as a district governor with a mission to strengthen the northern border and introduce strict taxes and deal with the problem of Lapland sorcerers. In 1620, we see the first ideas of diabolism emerge in the region of Finnmark and the first wave of panics. During his time in office, 41 people were accused of witchcraft, 35 of whom were women. Cunningham's influence can also be an explanation as to why Sami men were targeted. While Sami had been subject to subordination of Danish-Norwegian structures since the late Middle Ages, the post-Reformation period saw much harsher policies of Sami integration. Particularly in the 1630s, Sami men were brought to trial under Cunningham's power. This is most likely related to land and fishing disputes. Also, trials including Sami men could have been related to taxation, as they were a nomadic group who moved across borders and had a different philosophy of land ownership. Under Cunningham, elements of shamanism were demonized, such as the rune drum that was said to summon the devil. Their magic was seen as a science and was less serious than the witches' unions, but were nevertheless considered to be inherently evil by the government officials in Copenhagen. A pattern that can be seen in Finnmark is that every single time a new district governor was appointed, there was a new string of witch panics that contained new demonological components. Another reason that can't be ignored is the hostile tendency of Christianity towards women and the original sin. It is believed that women were more easily seduced by the devil since they lacked intellectual strength. Sami men, who were different from the Norwegian men and practiced pantheistic religions, were therefore seen as backwards and irrational and fit into this idea of lacking intellectual strength. Before 1620, most witch trials in the region were related to single cases of maleficarum, which is black magic or shamanism, but the emergence of this idea of diabolism led to strings of panics. The first wave of panics in the 1620s showed a fusion of traditional elements of folklore alongside diabolical ideas, but by the middle of the century, these ideas had taken a firm hold, and aspects of shamanism were tailored to fit that definition of witchcraft. Generalizations about Northwestern Europe do not fully fit Scandinavia because of this, and examining specific cases like the trials in Finnmark can reveal a lot about the cultural factors that were in place that led to this, as well as assumptions that have been made about witch trial history as a whole. Looking at Scandinavia is new, and a lot of information about the region has been corrected and looked at more seriously only within the last 20 years or so. From these examples, we can learn that when we look at Scandinavia, it's important to acknowledge the enormous diversity of experience of the people who live there, as well as complex factors that led to this outcome. In many ways, efforts at confessionalism and asserting a centralized authority follow patterns similar to those seen in Northwestern Europe. However, there are significant regional differences that historians have just begun to explore, particularly the important influence of Indigenous heritage in the area and the lag of time it took for the Reformation to take root. So thank you. That is my presentation.
Excellent. So as always, please send your comments via the chat and I will convey them on. But in the meantime, I would like to turn things over to Katy's mentor, Dr. Mitty Murr, to say a few words about Katy and her research and anything else she would like.
Oh, no, we can't hear you, Dr. Murr. Oh, do I? Oh, no, cool, okay.
Yeah, hopefully the unmute came on. So I just, probably like a lot of other advisors, I wanted to say what a pleasure it has been to work with you this semester. But even longer than that, we started having classes together, I guess, when you were a freshman. And it has just been a thrill to watch you grow up and grow as a scholar. And I think Katy is a good example of students who take seriously our Holy Cross values of challenging ourselves, taking risks. She's one who does not avoid complexity. I think her presentation gave you just a small taste of the complexity of the subject, and that's really been true for all the research projects Katy's done with me over the past couple of years. So it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Dr. Murr.
So here's your stult.
Wow.
And what about our snacks and our delicious desserts?
I know. What are we going to do without our cookies today?
Yes.
I have tea, that's about it. But
Yeah, I have chocolate.
Excellent. We'll give folks a few. We'll check the chat. So one of the questions I have for you, Katy, is what role or factor do you think the ruralness of these areas play into questions of witchcraft and powerful women and mischievousness?
yeah, I think that's a really important factor to this, because as you can see in that map of Scandinavia, Copenhagen was so far south, and then where the trials happened was just completely isolated. So when they sent officials there, they had a totally different idea of life, basically. So they kind of saw everything with a really skeptical eye. And I think that's a huge reason as to why the trials there were so severe. Because in the rest of the region, you know, you had certain cases, but Finnmark is really unique. And there's actually a memorial there now. Norway built one in 2011. It's really interesting. But yeah, also it's like they came from the south, they go up north, the sun is gone. It's scary, it's cold, and there's no trees. So I think all of this influenced their mindset. There's a lot of different factors. Oh, yeah.
We have another question coming in. Can you explain a little more what the differences between black magic and white magic in the trials?
Yeah, so basically, black magic was, okay, I'll start with white magic. White magic was benevolent magic, so it had a lot to do with healing. So a lot of the shamans that you had in this area, they did a lot of healing magic. And like I mentioned, they would sell wind, so good wind to sailors. Black magic, this is across Europe too, it kind of depended on where you were, but black magic was just malicious intent. So different spells, things like that. But black magic and white magic were usually pertaining to sorcerers or single issues. And then demonology kind of came in, and black magic kind of turned into this different theory under that ideology. So that's when you see pacts with the devil. And so things that would have usually been considered a small incident turned into a he said, she said of people just coming in and making pacts with the devil, and the accusations were taken really seriously. So I hope that kind of explains.
Yeah, we'll let the person who asked the question clarify if there's any additional information they would like.
Yeah, and there's a lot out there. If you're interested in that, you can really go down a rabbit hole. That's probably why my research has taken me so much time, is because there's a lot of interesting literature on the kind of things they were doing. And so that's also why the cultural tradition of the Sami, they were perceived as evil because they were beating drums and chanting. And so these people that came from Copenhagen were like, wow, this is the devil, just because it was different. And so that's been really influential there. And even today, there's lots of problems with the Sami as well, between Sami and Norwegians. Well, all Scandinavians and Russians. So, yeah.
Let's see if we can get some more questions. Where did how did this project get started for you? Like, do you even remember the first kind of intellectual itch that you were like, I want to know more about this?
Yeah, actually, I'm really interested in women's history, and I was really fortunate to study abroad in Finland in spring of 2019. So I actually went up and visited. I didn't realize this until like last week that the town that I visited was just a short a short place away from where these trials happened. So just being there, that was really interesting, and I had always been interested in the witch trials and not really looked into them. And as soon as I saw the statistics of how many men were accused of witchcraft in Scandinavia, that's when I got more interested in it and chose the topic. Although in Finnmark, it was still mostly women, but among the indigenous population, that's when it was more indigenous men who were killed. So.
And we got a follow up to your original question about the difference between black magic and white magic. Could you talk a little bit about how the difference between white magic and black magic affected sentencing?
Yeah, so actually white magic wasn't declared a crime for a while. That was a bit later that happened. And so even when it was illegal, it wasn't as severely punished. And when shamanistic magic and things like that, those trials usually happened individually. Those didn't always result in the death penalty. The death penalty was really a part of those demonic pacts. So as time progressed, that's kind of when the executions became more deadly, when that idea took place. But those were a lot less. The single trials really happened before the 1620s and after the 1670s. And those were mostly where you see the indigenous populations, with the exception of the 1630s. So yeah, really the sentencing came down to malicious intent and pacts with the devil. Anything that has to do with the devil wasn't good.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you, Dr. Murr. We're going to take a short 3-minute break, and we'll be back at 2:40 with our next presenter. So a round of applause for Katie for all your hard work from our homes to yours. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us today.
Thank you.
And we'll see everyone in just a few minutes.